What would you do if you found out that everything your family fought for, the land, the cattle, the blood, and the long, hard years, was built on a lie that your father carried to his grave without ever once looking back? Mae Calloway found out on a Tuesday morning in December, standing alone in her dead father's study with a letter in her hands that was never meant to be read by anyone, and certainly not by her. And what she found in that letter did not just change the way she understood her family. It changed the way she understood the 20 years of war between the Calloways and the Briggs family. The creek that ran between their two ranches like a wound that never closed, and the quiet, stubborn hatred that had poisoned both sides of that water for longer than she had been alive. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the beginning. The Calloway Ranch sat on the north side of Mineral Creek, and the Briggs Ranch sat on the south side, and the creek ran between them the way old grievances always run, steady and cold and impossible to cross without everyone noticing. It had been that way for 20 years, and in that county in West Texas, 20 years was long enough that most people had stopped asking why and simply accepted it as the natural order of things, the way you accept the drought or the wind or the particular loneliness of the open country. Mae Calloway was 28 years old, and she had grown up inside that order without ever questioning it. Raised by a father who said little and meant everything he said, and who had built the Calloway Ranch with 30 years of steady work and a long, unforgiving memory. William Calloway had been the kind of man who kept his accounts carefully and his feelings to himself, and his land in better shape than almost anyone else in the county. And Mae had spent her whole life trying to be the kind of woman he could be proud of, which meant she had spent her whole life learning to be careful and deliberate, and slow to trust, and quick to work. And she had never once crossed Mineral Creek because her father had told her not to, and she had never needed a reason beyond that. Tom Briggs was 32 years old, and he had grown up on the other side of the same order, raised by a father who was everything William Calloway was not. Loud where Calloway was quiet, reckless where Calloway was deliberate, and consumed by a grievance that he carried the way some men carry a weapon, always on him, and always ready, and always looking for the moment to use it. Gerald Briggs had never been specific about what exactly William Calloway had done to earn his hatred, at least not in any conversation Tom had ever been part of. And Tom had grown up understanding only that the Calloways were the enemy and the creek was the border, and those were the facts of his life, the same way the hills and the sky were the facts of his life. Gerald Briggs died in November, 3 weeks after William Calloway died in October, and Tom stood at his father's grave in the cold November wind and felt the particular loneliness of a man who has inherited a war he never chose and does not entirely understand. And he had no idea, standing there in that cold churchyard, that he was about to understand it completely. Mae found the letter at the bottom of the last box of her father's papers on a Tuesday morning in December, 6 weeks after his death, when she was going through 30 years of careful record-keeping, trying to make sense of the accounts and the deeds and all the accumulated paperwork of a life lived deliberately and without waste. The letter was folded twice and sealed with wax that had been broken and resealed more than once. Her father's name written on the outside in a handwriting she did not recognize, and she almost set it aside with the other things she could not immediately identify and come back to it later. She did not set it aside. She opened it standing at her father's desk in the gray December morning light, and read it through once and then read it again, because the first time through she could not entirely trust what she was reading. And by the time she finished the second reading, she had to sit down because her legs were not reliable anymore. The letter was from Gerald Briggs, dated 22 years ago, and it said that he knew about Ruth, that he knew she had chosen William, and that William had known what it would cost him and had let her choose him anyway, and that he was not writing to threaten anyone, but only to say that he understood now what kind of man William Calloway was, and that he would never forget it, not ever, not for as long as he lived, and that the creek would run between them until one of them was in the ground, and maybe longer. Mae sat at her father's desk and read those words in the cold gray light and thought about the name Ruth, which she knew because everyone in the county knew it in the particular way that people know the names of things that are never spoken about directly. Ruth Calloway, her father's sister, the woman who had left the county 30 years ago and never come back, the woman whose photograph was nowhere in the house and whose name her mother had spoken exactly once, quietly and without explanation, when Mae was 12 years old and found an old photograph and asked who the woman in it was. Mae crossed Mineral Creek for the first time in her life on a Wednesday morning, riding her gray horse through the cold, shallow water with the kind of deliberate calm that her father had taught her to use when she was doing something she was not entirely sure about, but had decided to do anyway. She had never crossed that water in 28 years of living beside it, and she understood, as she crossed it, that this was not a small thing, but the letter was in her coat pocket, and the weight of it was heavier than the cold, and heavier than 20 years of a rule she had never questioned. And she rode up through the south pasture to where Tom Briggs was mending fence, and stopped her horse 10 feet from him, and told him she needed to talk, and handed him the letter without further explanation. Tom Briggs read the letter, standing in the cold south pasture, with the wind coming off the hills and his horse watching from the fence line. And Mae watched his face while he read it, and saw him go very still in the way that people go still when something is rearranging itself inside them. And when he looked up at her, his expression was not what she had expected from a Briggs, which was to say it was not angry or defensive or hard. It was the expression of a man who has just been handed the explanation for something that has confused him his whole life, and is not sure yet whether the explanation is better or worse than the confusion. They stood there in the cold on the south side of Mineral Creek and talked for the first time in their lives. Two people who had grown up 50 yards apart across a creek that might as well have been an ocean. And what they found standing there in that cold pasture with the wind and the brown grass and the hills gray behind them was that neither of them had ever had a single thing to do with the war between their families, and that the war itself had never really been about land or water or cattle at all. It had been about one woman and two men, and a choice made 30 years ago that had poisoned everything downstream of it for 2 full decades. And both their fathers had gone to their graves without ever saying so plainly. They found Ruth in February after 6 weeks of quiet letters and careful asking around, and one long conversation with an old woman in town who had known both families 30 years ago and had kept their secret out of loyalty to William Calloway, and was by that point thoroughly tired of keeping it. Ruth Calloway was 71 years old, and she lived in a small house in San Antonio, and she had not spoken to her brother William in 28 years and did not know he was dead. And when Mae drove to San Antonio alone on a cold February morning, and knocked on the door of that small white house, and the door opened. She found herself looking at a woman with gray hair and green eyes exactly like her own, and understood immediately, and without any need for explanation, where her eyes had come from. Because her mother's eyes were brown, and her father's eyes were brown, and she had wondered about her own green eyes her whole life without ever thinking to wonder out loud. Ruth let her in, and they sat at the kitchen table for 4 hours, and Mae told her everything. The letter, the creek, the 20 years, Tom Briggs and Gerald Briggs, and all of it. And Ruth listened without interrupting. And when Mae finished, Ruth sat quietly for a long time before she said that she had loved them both, William and Gerald, in different ways and at the same time, and that she had been too young and too foolish to understand what choosing one of them would do to the other, and that she had chosen William because she thought it would be simpler, and it had not been simple at all, and she had left because Gerald looked at her the way a man looks at you when you have broken something in him that cannot be fixed, and she could not live with that look. And William had never forgiven her for leaving, and she had never forgiven him for making her feel like she had to. And so she had spent 30 years in San Antonio, in a small white house on a quiet street, carrying the particular weight of a thing left unfinished, and she was 71 years old now, and very tired of carrying it. Ruth came back to the county in March because Mae asked her to, and because she was 71 years old and tired of San Antonio and tired of unfinished things, and she stood at Gerald Briggs's grave on a cold March morning with Tom Briggs beside her, and was quiet for a long time before she told Gerald that she was sorry, that she had been young and foolish and should have come back a long time ago, and said that to his face while he could still hear it. And Tom stood beside her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and because he understood that this moment was not his, but hers and Gerald's, and he was only there to witness it. Then she stood at William Calloway's grave and told her brother that she forgave him for all of it, and that she should have done that a long time ago too. And Mae stood beside her and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tight until it loosened. Tom Briggs crossed Mineral Creek for the first time in his life on a Thursday in April, riding up to the Calloway ranch house and knocking on the door with his hat in his hands. And he and Mae sat at her kitchen table that evening and talked about the water rights and about the land and about all the practical things that 2 neighboring ranches needed to talk about and had not been able to talk about for 20 years. And then they talked about other things, and it was late when Tom finally rode back south across the creek, and the creek ran between the 2 ranches in the cold spring night the way it always had, steady and clear. But it did not look like a wound anymore. It looked like what it had always actually been, which was just water, just a creek running through the country the way water runs, without hatred and without memory and without any interest at all in the old grievances of the people who lived on either side of it. Ruth Calloway lived her last 4 years in a small house Mae found for her on the north side of the creek, and she died in the spring quietly in her chair by the window, looking out at the land. And Mae found her in the morning, and she looked peaceful. And this time, peaceful was exactly the right word for it. Tom and Mae were married the following October in a small ceremony with just the ranch hands and a few people from town, and one old woman who had kept a secret for 30 years and was glad to finally be done with it. And they built the kind of life together that is built slowly and carefully and with full knowledge of what it cost to get there. Mae would sometimes stand at the creek in the early morning and look at the water running between the two ranches and think about two young men and one young woman and all the years that had run away like that water. And she would think that love is a strange and costly thing, and that the people who pay the highest price for it are sometimes not the ones who chose it, but the ones who were born into the choosing of it. And she would think that the only answer to that, the only real answer, is to do better than the ones who came before you. She and Tom did better. That was enough. That was everything. Sometimes the war you inherit has nothing to do with you. And sometimes the only way to end it is to cross the water and say, enough. Let's start from here. What would you have done? Kept the secret or crossed the creek?